Hello, Synapse community. My name is Ryan Majitimer. I'm a product manager on the Azure Synapse Analytics team. Today I'm joined by Kevin Chant, and we're going to be talking about CI/CD for Dedicated SQL Pools. That's right, it's the January edition of the Synapse MVP video series. For those of you unfamiliar, each month we're joined by an MVP and we talk about something they're excited about. And well, CI/CD I think is something that everybody's excited about, so here we are. Going to hand it over to Kevin. Welcome.
Thanks for that, Ryan. And for the benefit of those I've yet to meet, my name is Kevin Chant, and I work for Avanade in the Netherlands. However, as some of you can probably tell from the accent, I'm actually originally from the southwest of the UK. Now, when Azure Synapse Analytics was first introduced, a question a lot of people had was, how are they going to be able to perform CI/CD for their dedicated SQL pools? So I had a look into this and discovered that you can use the same state-based deployment method that you use for SQL Server deployments with the aid of what is known as a database project. And I can actually show you how this looks now in Azure Data Studio. So I have Azure Data Studio opened up here. And for those of you who have not seen Azure Data Studio before, you can think of it as an alternative to SQL Server Management Studio, with the added benefit that it can be installed on both Mac OS and Linux as well. Now, it may look similar to the Visual Studio Code to some of you, and that's because it was forked from the Visual Studio Code repository some time ago. Now, in Azure Data Studio, I've installed an extension called SQL Database Projects, and this allows me to work with database projects in Azure Data Studio. Now, for those of you who have not seen database projects before, you can think of it as the schema definition of your databases translated into code. So for example, if I drill down into one of the files here, you can see it's the T-SQL definition of a SQL object. Now, there are various ways you can create these database projects. For example, in Azure Data Studio, you can navigate to an existing dedicated SQL pool, right-click and select Create Project from Database. Now, there are plenty of other ways you can do this as well. For example, Microsoft have a blog post on how you can automate getting the code out of your dedicated SQL pool into a database project. Now, once you've created a database project, you can look to initialize the folder that it's in to be a Git repository. And then from there, you can look to synchronize your local Git repository with a Git repository that is stored in Azure DevOps. For example, this one here. And then once you have that database project inside Azure DevOps, you can actually use Azure pipelines to deal with the deployments from that existing repository. So for example, here I have a pipeline which is based on the classic editor, and what this particular pipeline does, it creates a file called a DAT pack based on that database project and then publishes it into Azure DevOps. Once that's done, I can use the releases feature in Azure pipelines to then deploy that DAT pack onto one or more dedicated SQL pools.
Can we use this with Visual Studio?
Yes, you can do this in Visual Studio as well, as long as you have SQL Server Data Tools installed, which allows you to work with database projects.
Let's see it in action.
Sure, and just for good measure, I'll show you the different pipeline options that you have in Azure DevOps as well. Now, there are actually two ways that you can work with deployment pipelines in Azure DevOps. The first is the more traditional GUI-based method, where you use the classic editor, which I showed you earlier, to do your builds, basically to create your objects you wish to deploy, and then use the releases feature to have a GUI based method to do your releases to one or more objects. And then the other method is by using what's known as YAML pipelines. So first of all, I will just go into a bit more detail about the classic editor and the releases side of it first. So we're back in Azure DevOps, as you can see. And once you have your Git repository, as I mentioned earlier, you can look to use deployment pipelines in Azure Pipelines. So to create a build pipeline, basically using the classic editor, you can select new pipeline and then scroll down and select to use the classic editor. And then from there, you can create one like I created earlier. So if I go to edit this particular one, you can see that this particular build pipeline has two tasks of it. The first one is to build the database project for me. So basically it takes the database project that's in that Git repository and then creates what's known as a DATPack file for me. And then once that DATPack file has been created, I then publish it back in the Azure DevOps to be available elsewhere for free use. Now, for those who've never heard of a DATPack file before, it's basically a special type of file that you can use to deploy updates to, for example, SQL Server databases, and in this case, dedicated SQL pools. So once the artifact is in Azure DevOps, you can look to use the releases feature to actually do your deployments, or in other words, a release. So if I click on the edit for this particular one, what this one actually does, it grabs the artifact that I created through the classic editor to do the build. And then from there, it will actually look to deploy it. And if I click on this particular one, what it does first is deploys, downloads even, the build artifact that I created in the classic editor. So basically it's downloading the artifact that contains the DATPack. And then I actually use that DATPack to deploy updates to a dedicated SQL pool using the Azure SQL database deployment task that's available in Azure DevOps. So that's the traditional way of doing it. And there is now a more modern way by using YAML pipelines. And before I go any further about YAML pipelines, I'm going to return to Azure Data Studio. So we can see the whole process from beginning to end. So I'm just first of all going to make a change to one of the files and save it. And then in source control, I'm just going to type in change column. And then I'm going to do what's known as a commit. So this basically hardens the change to my local Git repository. And then Azure Data Studio kindly invites me to synchronize my changes with the Git repository in Azure DevOps. So if we go back to Azure DevOps now, and we go back into the repository, you can see that just now there was an update. And if I go to pipelines, you can see that I've actually got a pipeline run taking place. And if I click on this particular pipeline and I click on edit, you will see straight away that it's YAML code. And it's actually the code-based version of what I showed you just now in the classic editor and the releases. And that's one of the benefits of YAML pipelines. You can do your builds and releases in one pipeline all at once. And to highlight this, and I'll make this a bit bigger so you can read it all a bit easier. If I scroll down, you can see I'm basically doing a build to create the DATPack from the database project, the same as in the classic editor. and then publishing the artifact that contains that pack file. And then if I scroll further down, you can see that I am doing a deployment again. So if we go back now to the pipeline run, you can see it's actually completed. And if I click on there and I scroll down, you can see, yep, it published an artifact. And if I scroll down to the bottom, you can see that it's not just done the build, but it's also done the deployment as well. So that is how you can perform CI/CD for dedicated SQL pools using Azure DevOps. I actually have a blog post and a template you can use that's available on GitHub to be able to do this.
That's pretty cool. But hey, what about GitHub?
Yes, you can. In fact, I can actually show you how that looks in GitHub now. So, in GitHub, I have a GitHub repository which contains exactly the same database project that you saw in Azure DevOps, with a slight difference that it actually uses GitHub Actions to do the deployment. So if I click on the Actions tab, you will see I've actually done a deployment using a workflow earlier. So if I click on here, and I scroll down, you can see it's completed. Now, to do this using GitHub Actions, I had to create a workflow. And the workflow is essentially a YAML file that is saved in the GitHub repository. So if I click on the .github workflows folder structure, and you can see there is a YAML file there. I click on the file and I scroll down a bit and I make the screen a bit bigger. You will notice that it uses similar logic to the YAML pipeline in Azure DevOps. However, the schema is slightly different. And before I go any further, just to make it clear, at this moment in time at least, you can only use YAML files to do the deployments using GitHub Actions. There is no GUI based method like you get in Azure DevOps. So if I scroll down, you'll see that the workflow will run every time the main branch has a push basically. I do a build using similar logic to earlier. So basically creating a DAT pack based on the database project and then uploading the artifact into GitHub for use. And then I can actually use the DAT pack file that's created within the artifact to do the deployment again. And as you may notice here in this particular workflow, I'm actually connecting it to Keyvault because it's good practice. In fact, I did the same earlier in the pipelines you show in Azure DevOps as well. This is just a slightly different way of connecting to it. And then from there, I'm doing the deployment using a GitHub action called SQL action. So basically, whenever you see a users and it's got the name of something with a forward slash and then references something else, that is effectively an action in GitHub action. And the one thing I want to highlight with this particular one is that I'm using version 2 of SQL action, which has a bit more functionality than the original version of SQL action, so it's worth looking into. However, when you do use version 2 of the SQL action, the syntax is slightly different. So if you are going to start using it, just be aware of that. So that is how you can do CI/CD for a dedicated SQL pool using GitHub Actions. And again, I do have a blog post relating to this, as well as a template available in the GitHub repository that you can use as well.
Well, that wraps up our video for today. Thanks, Kevin, for joining us. Tell us in the comments, have you seen this way of using CI/CD with dedicated SQL pools? Do you have your own ways of doing CI/CD with Synapse? I'd love to hear about it. Again, my name is Ryan Magittimer. You can find me on Twitter. You can find Kevin on Twitter, Kev Chant. You can also find Synapse on Twitter, Azure_Synapse. And more importantly, if you like Twitter, if you like social media in general, we've got just the program for you, the Azure Synapse Influencers program. And there's exciting things. There are titles, champion, contender, challenger. Yes, 3 titles. The big 3C, if you will. C's. Also, there are exciting things like mugs. Yes. Azure Synapse Influencer mugs. There are stickers, private events, private Q&As with experts. It's very exciting, very easy to sign up. Just a couple clicks away. Look in the description of the video to find out more information. Like, comment, subscribe. Thanks for watching, and we'll catch you on the next one.